A while back, I secured a position at a small medical facility located just outside the city limits. I was thrilled, as it was the initial employment opportunity one had received following my graduation. Although it was only casual employment, I was nonetheless delighted at the prospect of working there, given the attractive remuneration and the fact that it was where I had completed my practical training. Typically, I would undertake 12-hour shifts, spanning from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Occasionally, I would cover the late shift, from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. I never particularly minded these, having been accustomed to late hours from prior jobs, but it did necessitate a considerably longer drive home. Our team comprised 4 nurses, an administrator, myself, and the on-call emergency physician. In a compact hospital setting like this, one encounters a variety of unusual cases. Given that some individuals are unable to reach the city, we've had instances where the emergency helicopter needed to land intermittently. I've witnessed some truly harrowing events, such as entire families perishing in accidents on winding rural roads. I've even had individuals bring in animals in urgent situations, as there was no accessible veterinarian in the vicinity. On this specific evening, around 10 p.m., I was seated and conversing with a fellow nurse regarding a patient's medical records, though I was primarily occupying myself until my shift concluded at 11 p.m. The hospital environment was exceptionally tranquil. I had admitted only 6 patients up to that juncture. I then detected an unusual sound near the entrance, music. Subsequently, I observed a man advancing towards us. His appearance was relatively unremarkable, but he wore a lengthy coat, which seemed peculiar given that it was the height of summer, and despite the darkness, the temperature remained quite high. The nurse beside me emitted a protracted sigh and rose to use the restroom, leaving me to attend to the newcomer. As he approached, the peculiar sound intensified, and something reflected the light. He was pulling an object behind him, but I couldn't discern its nature, though I inferred it was metallic based on the abrasive noise it produced, which caused a chill to run down my spine. He halted at the reception desk, and I could see his eyes were dilated, his pupils enlarged, his complexion pallid, and he appeared to have been deprived of sleep for some time. I had encountered this demeanor numerous times previously and promptly associated it with someone under the influence of a substance. He leaned on the desk, ran his fingers through his hair, tugging at it and clenching his teeth. Individuals presenting in this manner are typically seeking medication. Frequently, they will complain of migraines or fibromyalgia, conditions we cannot definitively disprove. I registered him as per standard procedure and noted he was growing progressively more agitated as time elapsed. Upon completing the registration, I directed him towards the waiting area. He then inquired about the anticipated wait time, and knowing that the on-call physician had taken a brief respite, I approximated a duration of 30 minutes. It was then that his entire disposition transformed. The ire on his face was evident as he stormed towards the waiting area, a space situated between the emergency room and the front desk. As he moved away, I glimpsed the object he was dragging and swiftly realized it was an axe. I was overcome with alarm and nearly initiated the emergency code via the public address system, but I refrained, not wanting to alert him. I promptly contacted the authorities using my mobile phone and hastened down the corridor to alert the nurses to the situation. The police would need to travel from 2 towns away, a journey typically requiring 20 minutes. Naturally, as we were all relatively petite women, we were reluctant to approach him. This man was imposing in stature and musculature. Even collectively, we would have been no match for him. I calmly returned to the front desk and paged the physician, requesting a call back. I waited and waited, but received no response. I observed the man becoming increasingly restless, and soon he commenced shouting, demanding assistance. I quickly concealed myself from his view. The other nurses and I formulated a strategy to confine him within the waiting area. The glass was reinforced, and the doors were substantial, so it should have been capable of containing him until the police arrived. The plan proceeded seamlessly until the man comprehended our actions. He began yelling and displacing chairs within the room. He then started to employ his axe on the door. We were all positioned near the front desk, observing. I have never experienced such intense fear in my life, and what exacerbated the situation was the realization that he was making progress on the door. It was around this juncture that the emergency physician returned from his break. He ambled through the main entrance, still sipping a beverage, when he noticed us congregated by the front desk. He immediately assumed control of the situation. After receiving all the pertinent details, he vanished towards the rear entrance, typically utilized by the EMTs. He then unlocked one of the waiting room doors and tackled the man when he was unsuspecting. He secured the man's wrists with cable ties and remained seated on his back until the law enforcement officers arrived. I was profoundly thankful for the presence of a youthful, physically robust physician that night. I procured coffee for him whenever our schedules coincided as a gesture of gratitude, but I doubt it will ever fully suffice. As this was the second unsettling event I encountered while working the 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. shift, I resolved to never work late shifts again. I am currently on a Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. schedule, and I feel considerably more secure now. Last August, I was admitted to the voluntary psychiatric ward at the nearby hospital due to some significant anxiety and depression concerns I was experiencing. Regrettably, it was my second hospitalization, and this time I would be required to share a room. The rationale remains unclear, but for some reason, when the psychiatric unit was constructed, they opted to include double rooms. Consequently, they would often have high-functioning patients share accommodations. Since I had been here approximately a month prior, the nurses recognized me upon my arrival. Stays in the psychiatric unit typically range from 1 to 2 weeks. Because it's the voluntary unit, there are no individuals present who are actively psychotic or exhibiting violent tendencies. Generally, my roommate, Jane, appeared pleasant enough. She was an understated, diminutive woman. One activity she particularly relished was sitting at her desk and engaging in crossword puzzles. Indeed, it seemed to be the sole pursuit she ever engaged in. Within the rooms, each patient is provided with a desk and a dresser, which are positioned adjacently. I was admitted to the hospital around 6 p.m., and by 9:30 p.m., I had taken my prescribed medication and was practicing meditation prior to retiring for the night. I was contemplating a captivating image of a tree and fence affixed to the wall, focusing on it while regulating my breathing. It was then that I discerned writing on it. I hadn't noticed it previously. It was inscribed in pencil and embedded into the picture with sufficient pressure to create an indentation. The inscription read, "They are all liars, __, liars." There were some additional elements I couldn't fully decipher. It unsettled me somewhat, but I presumed it must have been the work of the previous occupant, so I proceeded to the nurses' station to inform them. If you have ever been admitted to a psychiatric ward, you will be aware that it is, for the most part, exceedingly monotonous. I passed the majority of my days ambulating around the unit. Some patients would meticulously count their laps. Apparently, 30 laps corresponded to a mile. I also allocated time to the art room, engaging in painting with a group. I began to observe that Jane never participated in any of the group activities. In fact, she never departed from the room. Subsequently, I realized that I had never witnessed her leaving her desk. Each occasion I entered our room, she would be seated there, engrossed in a crossword. I surmised that this was her method of coping with the tedium of the environment. I endeavored to engage in casual conversation with her as I entered and exited. I then noticed something peculiar. The crossword puzzle she was working on remained unchanged. It was the identical one, with no discernible progress. I would liken it to the scene from The Shining, where Mrs. Torrance uncovers that all Jack had been composing for his screenplay was, "All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy." It's a rather unnerving method of discovering that someone has deteriorated mentally. On the second night, I returned around 10:30 p.m. to retire, and she was still seated at the desk, working on that same crossword puzzle with the lights illuminated. I dismissed it, as by this juncture, she was no longer responding to my greetings or inquiries about joining the group. It was conceivable that she could have been experiencing an adverse reaction to medication or simply preferred not to converse, so I extinguished all my lights and drew my privacy curtain closed. The medication I was prescribed at the time essentially rendered me unconscious, enabling me to fall asleep relatively swiftly. Around 2 a.m., I was awakened by a medical assistant inquiring of my roommate whether she believed it was time to retire or extinguish her light so that her roommate, referring to me, could sleep. She did not offer a substantive response to the individual and did not turn off the light. I ultimately just rolled back over and resumed sleeping. At some juncture, she had extinguished the light and retired, as I awoke sometime later in absolute darkness. I was perplexed. The medications I was taking typically induced sleep for 12 consecutive hours. I then realized I could perceive someone speaking. It was Jane. She reiterated, "Jesse, help me. Jesse, help me." I responded with, "Jane, are you all right?" She did not reply to me but persisted in repeating the phrase, so I surmised she might be talking in her sleep. Eventually, I drifted off again, only to reawaken at some later point. She was uttering the same phrase, only with greater intensity this time. I knew that she was not somniloquizing this time. I attempted to elicit a response from her, but she never acknowledged my presence. She merely continued to elevate her voice, "Jesse, help me. I need help, Jesse." I arose and went to summon the night nurse, whose name was Jessie. I informed her that my roommate was calling for her. By the time we returned to the room, Jane was in a state of hysteria. She was crying out for Jessie and attempting to rise from her bed. Jessie endeavored to pacify her, and I was shaken, but I was administered another sedative and eventually returned to sleep. When I awoke the following morning, Jane was absent from the room, and a table that had once been situated near her bed was now positioned in front of the bathroom curtain. There were no doors due to self-harm precautions. I went to use the restroom, and there was an entire roll of toilet tissue in the toilet bowl. Once again, I went to summon a nurse, as I did not wish to be held accountable for flooding the restroom. I had already inadvertently flooded a private restroom during my first day. When I emerged onto the floor, I realized two things. Firstly, there was a medical assistant stationed by the door near the front desk. Secondly, Jane was also standing at the door. The door only opens when someone phones in, so I was bewildered as to why there needed to be someone essentially guarding the entrance. I learned from another patient, who suffered from insomnia, that my roommate had spent the night running around the ward and displacing furniture. They had ultimately summoned security personnel to speak with her, and she had calmed down, but then stood in front of the door and remained standing there, like a statue, for 4 hours. I proceeded with my customary routine of consuming breakfast and painting. I inquired with some of the assistants about my roommate, and they informed me that she had been standing there since their shift commenced at 6 a.m. It was now 10:30 a.m. This made me somewhat uneasy, but I continued painting. I noticed something from the periphery of my vision. I looked up and observed Jane outside the room, peering in at me. She perceived me looking up and swiftly averted her gaze, but she did not move for a solid 20 minutes. I became unnerved and decided to return to my room. For the first time that morning, she followed me into the room. I feigned as though I was merely retrieving something and departed again, proceeding to the assistant seated at the front desk. I politely conveyed that I might sound somewhat paranoid, but I believed my roommate was following me. Consequently, she permitted me to sit with her at the front desk. Because I was seated there with nothing to occupy me, I decided to contact my insurance provider with an inquiry. As I was on the phone, Jane approached with 2 plastic bins filled with items. Upon initial admission to the unit, they provide you with a plastic bin containing various supplies. The bins were replete with her belongings and my belongings. She also possessed the pillowcase from my bed, which contained my clothing. I lost control. Why does she have my possessions? That's my iPad. I began to experience a degree of panic. I do have anxiety issues myself. There were 3 nurses present, and they were astounded. They had never witnessed anything comparable. I am now on the floor, weeping profusely, and someone kneels down and places their arm around me. "It's going to be all right. You're going to be fine." I had my eyes closed and presumed it was a nurse, but in a peculiar turn of events, it was actually Jane. I instructed her to cease touching me and then informed the nurses that I desired her to be removed from my proximity. The nurses ultimately escorted me into a private meeting room to examine my belongings. They then informed me that Jane would be transferred to the involuntary ward at some point during the day. Regrettably, due to Jane's conduct, I could not return to my room until the transfer was finalized. While all of this was transpiring, Jane had now relocated to the rear door, which opens into a stairwell leading down to the outdoor garden. There was no means for her to open it, obviously, and she simply remained standing there for hours. After a period, I began to disregard her, although she would fixate on me whenever I was within her line of sight. It was approximately 6 o'clock or 7 p.m., my husband had arrived to visit me, and we were engaged in a card game with another patient who had recently been admitted to our unit. We were seated in the cafeteria, which was situated adjacent to where Jane was waiting, separated by a wall of windows. I believe she had positioned herself there deliberately so that she could maintain visual contact with me. As we were playing rummy, we observed the psychiatrist approaching with 2 security guards. She commenced explaining to Jane that she needed to proceed upstairs now. Jane became agitated and refused to comply. A security guard attempted to take her arm, and she then erupted, turning to one of the windows and commencing to pound on it, gazing directly at me and imploring me to come to her aid. They literally dragged her, kicking and screaming, upstairs. I was somewhat perturbed, but at least she was no longer present. I subsequently acquired another roommate, also named Jane, but this new Jane was exceedingly amiable, and she was in the unit because she was undergoing detoxification from a medication. My attending psychiatrist reassured me that my reaction was entirely normal, and so I began to feel significantly improved. The following day, after lunch, it was time to visit the garden. I genuinely relished going outside. It's revitalizing after spending so many hours confined within the ward. At the time, we were only permitted 30 minutes. I experienced anxiety when I observed that Jane, my former roommate, was one of the individuals in the garden from the upstairs unit, so I inquired with one of the supervisors if I could be seated near them during garden time. They assented, and everything proceeded without incident. Jane did not approach me at all. Now, you might perceive me as being somewhat melodramatic, but Jane is one of those individuals who only feigns inattentiveness. However, it only presents that appearance. When we returned inside, since I did not require an escort back to my unit, I ensured I disengaged from the group and distanced myself from Jane as promptly as possible. However, Jane then made a direct approach towards me, and she had to be restrained once more. I did not encounter her again after that. I suspect the hospital staff perhaps realized that having her in any proximity to me was ill-advised. Something about me triggered her, and I prefer not to contemplate what might have transpired if she had continued to be my roommate. Music. This is a narrative recounted to me by my mother when I was of an age to comprehend what had nearly befallen me. I was merely a few weeks old at the time. In those days, when a mother had given birth and brought her newborn home, midwives were dispatched from the hospital to check on the infant and the mother once or twice a week. My father was working, so he was not at home, and my mother had put me to sleep and was attending to her domestic tasks. 2 midwives had visited earlier that week, so she was perplexed when she heard a knock at the door. We resided in a very tightly knit community where crime was infrequent, but the majority of residents were employed for most of the day, so it was essentially deserted around this time. My mother was met by a male and a female, both attired in hospital uniforms with security badges. They politely inquired if they could enter. They explained that they had been sent by the hospital. My mother permitted them entry because they presented as professionals, with the badges and uniforms, they even possessed knowledge that she had a baby girl and my mother's name. It was highly convincing at the time, but that information was readily accessible. The man stated that he would take me upstairs to examine me, and the woman would attend to my mother downstairs. However, my mother felt uneasy about their desire to separate us, and she explained that a pair of midwives had already visited that week and indicated that she would contact the hospital, as nobody had notified her of a subsequent visit just a day later. She also cautioned them that her husband, my father, was en route home from work and would not be pleased about this unscheduled visit. At this juncture, the two became highly defensive and declared that they would depart after being exceedingly insistent with my mother to separate the two of us. Following the exchange, she ultimately persuaded them to leave. They swiftly altered their demeanor to a more composed one and stated not to be concerned, that it must have been an oversight. What was even more peculiar, though, was that when my mother opened the door for them to depart, there was another individual waiting in a vehicle outside, with the engine still running. She contacted the hospital, and they informed her that they had no midwife scheduled to visit her that day and that they would invariably alert the mother if they were dispatching one. They also mentioned that they would never request to separate the mother and the infant. My mother provided them with a description of the visitors, and they informed her that they had no male midwives at that hospital and that she should contact the authorities immediately. Petrified, my mother summoned my father, who returned home directly from work, and they reported the incident to the police, but it never culminated in anything that we are aware of. Who knows what those two were intending to do? If they had gained access to all the information concerning my mother, they must have had someone observing the house and were cognizant that my father would not be present, and they had even undertaken the effort of procuring the uniforms and badges. Thank goodness my mother acted upon her instincts and ensured their departure from the house. It's even more unsettling to contemplate what my life might be like now if they had succeeded in carrying out their intentions that day. I do not believe this could have been a legitimate misunderstanding. They had not adhered to standard protocol, and nobody informed my mother of their visit, and they were exceedingly impolite and defensive when my mother questioned them, which is unacceptable conduct from a healthcare professional. I believe we were exceedingly fortunate that they elected to leave. My mother could not have intervened if they had chosen to employ force. I simply hope they did not subject anyone else to this. There is always a rationale to be apprehensive.